All right, Jane Coaston, welcome to the Realignment.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for coming.
Absolutely. So, Jane, you actually reached out to me to quote me in a story, so I
Yes.
obviously had to reciprocate and bring you on this podcast. But for real is, we both, Marshall and I, we followed your work for quite some time. You work at Vox, you cover the right, and I think it's maybe fair to say from a left perspective. Left-ish perspective.
I've occasionally, I have many people who spend a lot of time trying to figure out, like, my political allegiances, and I always tell them the exact wrong thing. Like, recently someone emailed me, like, we know you're a committed Republican. I'm like, no, I'm a monarchist. I long for the return of the Habsburg Empire.
There's a lot of those on the right now, too.
I was going to say,
it's a fair thing.
You might be closer to some of the listeners than you may know.
Sub-tradcons.
There we go. I mean, the sizable part of the audience. I think one of the things we want to start off with you and talk about is just like, how did you get into this? Because what has always fascinated me about your work is that you really have sought to actually understand the right when you write about it, which, you know, you would think is a prerequisite for many of these people, but is apparently not. How did you come to find this beat, so to speak? And I know that, I mean, you've publicly said you were kind of on the right, libertarian right, in the beginning on yourself. So what kind of put you on the path forward?
Well, it's interesting. I've always been interested in whatever the political ideology that is my exact opposite is. So my parents are Union Democrats. I talked about my dad yesterday, and now my dad is going to be interviewed by NPR because he's a black man in a swing state, so people are very interested to hear what he has to say.
Hot commodity.
You can come on the podcast if he wants afterwards.
I think we could get this all going. And so, but I grew up in Cincinnati, and so, you know, very Republican state, especially at that time. It's more so, less so, it depends. And so I was interested in the people who I knew who espoused conservative viewpoints. Granted, when you're in grade school, if you're espousing conservative viewpoints, it's because your parents are conservatives.
Right.
And this was like Clinton era and then Bush era conservatism. And so it was a little bit different. But I was just so fascinated by it. Like, I actually find my own political leanings kind of boring and esoteric. I think that that's how most people's personal politics are.
Right.
Like, I'm always interested in, you know, or fascinated by people who are very much like, my politics is like, I'm a strict whatever this is. Because I'm like, that's not how people work. That would just being like, I like everything on the menu at Chipotle.
Yeah.
Every single thing. And I do not need anything besides that menu. And I'm like, that sounds weird and boring. And so I started out, actually, I was editor-in-chief of a conservative libertarian newspaper in college. Not really being either of those things. I think I've become more libertarian as time has gone on. But at the time I was not. But I was interested in the subject. And I've always said that, you know, if you're an editor of something, like, you just ask your writers, like, is it true and can you prove it? And I'm like, go nuts with whatever you want to say. And so I thought that, you know, I could edit pretty much anybody, provided they, you know, is it true and did it happen and can you prove it? And then, you know, I kind of got pushed out of journalism a little bit because I had a journalism fellowship in St. Louis in 2010 at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And then it turns out finding a journalism job in a Rust Belt city is hard.
Oh, yeah.
So I did PR. I wrote about college sports at night for SB Nation. So I covered the NFL and college football, which I think was invaluable. People will never be as mad at me as they were when I wrote about Ray Rice and beating up his fiance. Like, never in life will people be that mad. And so it's funny when people are like, oh, how do you deal with it now? I'm like, no. This is nothing. Like, getting, like, weird racist emails, I'm like, that's fine. Whatever. And then a friend of mine in sports writing world invited me to go write at MTV, and that's kind of where I started doing this. And I really wanted to emphasize how much of my work is not oppo research, which I think a lot of times when people who are purportedly on the left write about the right, they write about it in, like, this is what these people want to do to you.
Yes.
And I think that you get that somewhat on in conservative media when they're writing about the left, is like, you know, they're writing about it as if you may have never seen a Democrat in life. And, you see that in left-leaning journalism of like Republicans being kind of a hypothetical thing. And
for many people, it
Right.
sort of is. That's the whole point about sorting,
Right.
right? If you're sort of a New York City resident, I don't think you've met a Trump voter, right?
Right.
To a
Or
certain degree.
you've met like the very weird Trump voters. They like
You've met the guys who are like, I voted MAGA for the tax cut.
Right.
And you're
or
like, well,
I'm an extraordinary wealthy gay man and I
Yeah.
love Trump because
Right.
of reasons. And
Who are you possibly talking about, Jay?
who could possibly say? But I didn't want to do that. I started out, I did a series at MTV that was like conversations with conservatives. And like, I talked to Ben Dominic for like 3 hours, in part about the Iraq War. And I talked to Charles C.W. Cook, and I talked to a whole bunch of people who I thought were interesting because I think so much of journalism now a lot of times focuses heavily on like who people are and not so much on what they say or what they do. I am not particularly interested in people like their people being bad. I'm really interested in the ideas that people have, whether or not those are good or bad, because I think for a lot of times, especially when people talk about Trump specifically, they're like he's boorish. And I'm like, I don't care if he's boorish. I'm concerned about the Nigerian travel ban that appears
Right.
to have appeared out of nowhere that the Nigerian government was surprised by. Like the actions that are being taken, I think I'm like, him being on Twitter a lot, like I'm on Twitter a lot.
Yes.
So who am I to judge?
Well said.
Yeah, so what year, actually, to follow up, what year were you doing those conversations? Because I think that what's interesting about the conservative movement, what we cover here, is that the conversation you'd be having in 2013
Yeah.
is way different than
Oh.
2017.
2013 was thousands of years ago. This would be 2016, 2017.
So you were right on the cusp of
Oh, yeah.
the realignment.
It's been funny because there are a couple of people I spoke to at the time
Yeah.
who were like, Trump is the worst thing that's ever happened. I can't believe this is happening. I don't know how to stop it. And now those people are kind of like, we're just going to ride the bomb. Like, it's interesting to see how that's happened. But I think it's understandable. I think at a certain point, when, community pressure exists, but also if someone does things that you like doing, it's going to be harder for you to be like, this is an esoteric challenge to my identity.
Right.
When it just sort of looks like what a Republican presidency would normally look like.
And what's funny is I think a lot of Republicans, especially at the elite level, sort of hold your position about journalism in the sense that, yeah, Trump tweets boorish things, but if I look down the line, if I like tax cuts, if I'm judges,
Oh, yeah.
there's plenty to like there, whether like that's
Yeah.
good or bad, but if you're a Republican,
Yeah, and it's interesting also because I think that Trump or the people around him triangulated correctly towards Mitch McConnell. Like, he became more like Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell did not become more like him.
in no way whatsoever.
Right, because, if you hearken back to the campaign, people, like, Republicans were not necessarily concerned that Trump would be mean on the internet. Republicans were concerned that he would basically be Huey Long, but in 2016. Like, a populist president who was going to spend billions of dollars on infrastructure and on doing these specific things that, like, independent voters were like, that sounds awesome. But, like, rock-ribbed Republicans were like, no, thank you, we don't want that.
Let's do healthcare and taxes first.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that worked out real well.
Yeah, and especially because Trump was like, healthcare seems hard. And everyone who has been alive was like, yeah,
Yeah,
it
my
is.
favorite quote of his was, nobody knew healthcare would be so complicated.
Which I just, Paul Ryan, like I've been trying to reach out to Paul Ryan now because he's at AEI and his person is like, he's not really doing interviews right now. And I'm like, I understand why, because I think that just a 45 minutes of sighing wouldn't really be like
Yeah, it wouldn't
Compelling
be that.
primo
audio.
content. But it's interesting to see how that transition has happened, and it's funny because I think that when we talked about this when I spoke to you, that one of the challenges is that the message of 2015, 2016 Trump and the message of 2020 Trump are like two different things, and 2020 Trump is basically like, imagine if you had voted for you got Mitch McConnell. You got Mitch McConnell unbound. And so is that what not necessarily Republican voters, but is that what independent voters who are kind of like, well, I really don't like Hillary Clinton and this Trump guy, he's weird, but, these specific things he keeps saying sound great. I don't know if that's what you were going for, because I think Trump was effective in that I've made this comparison a lot, so if you've heard me say it before, you can ignore it, but, he kind of campaigned as the tabula rasa candidate.
Yes.
Where you could project all of your hopes and dreams onto him, and whatever it was, he's both like best friend to evangelicals, or he's like the most pro-LGBT GOP president ever. And all of that could somehow be true and not true. And it's interesting because I don't think that there is there's been a lot of weird Bernie Trump comparisons that I think are very dumb. I do think the thing about Bernie is that like he's been basically the same guy since like 1978, but the projection from some Sanders supporters is going outward of like, and here's where he convinces Joe Manchin to do these things. Right. And I'm like, have you seen Joe Manchin? Like,
so why is the comparison so? I mean, let's go into that. Like, why is that a dumb comparison? Because to devil's advocate your argument before you even make your argument, we're very fair here on the podcast.
Absolutely.
They are anti-establishment. They are disliked by the people in their establishment. And Trump, in certain weird ways, has actually been consistent on issues that don't necessarily...
I was going to say, in terms of that tabula rasa thing, you're right on some issues, but on the ones that mattered the most, he was just like Bernie. Had been the same thing on trade basically from the very beginning.
Yeah, he's
always
thought that debt is good,
right,
and that trade is kind of bad.
Yeah,
but I'm thinking more of the fact that like he knew who Pat Buchanan was, and then just suddenly forgot who Pat Buchanan was, which we all selectively forget things we don't want to know about. I think that the comparison my colleague Matt Iglesias has written about this, but Sanders there's like Bernie Sanders. Not me, us, like campaign Bernie Sanders. And then there's Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont. And those are, Senator Bernie Sanders has been a pretty, like, normal, independent, Democrat-leaning senator. He was outspoken. I mean, he's been really outspoken against, like, the Patriot Act, but so has Rand Paul. Like, there have been a lot of issues in which he's been, like, normal. And I think that there is, in a lot of how we think about politics, there's kind of the person and then there's the idea of the person. It's how Trump can somehow become like the concept of masculinity, except when you look at Trump, you're like, really? All right, whatever. And then Bernie Sanders becomes like, Vladimir Lenin, when in actuality, I'm like, no, this is a guy who, like, he's been in the Senate for a long time. He knows how things work, and, like, he knows how the concept of politics actually works. And so I think the comparison doesn't quite work because I think that for Sanders, it's not so much, with Trump, it was sort of like, I alone can do this, and if you just let me handle it, I'll figure it out in some way because I'm a business deal-making genius. With Sanders, it's sort of like, he is the rock you drop in the pond, and then it ripples outwards to cause political change. How? Unclear. But
they have a theory, sorry.
There is a theory of change here, and the theory of change appears to rest on a couple of variables that we have not yet gotten filled in yet. But I think that, what The Rock looks like is like Medicare for all. Like, it's these concepts. And, like, I think that is a difference. I also think that there is something about our politics. And I think that, I said before that writing about sports was, like, the best possible training for doing this because when you win a really big game, there's a narrative shift about who you are as a team. Even if you won that big game in a way because the other team was bad or because of like a weird backwards fumble or like, I don't know, a neutral zone infraction that pushed the yardage back 5 yards, whatever. And then the next game happens and there's another narrative shift. And so I think that a lot of people are still back on the narrative shift that was 2016 and they haven't yet gotten to the narrative shift that was 2017, 2018, 2019 special elections.
Right.
And so I think it's important to think about not so much about like the narrative of it, this campaign or what 2016 looked like, but to think about what's taking place right now.
I think that's a good point. And one of the other things that we actually try and do here is not just focus on Trump, but kind of what's bubbling under the surface and more what did he unleash within the American right? What did he change in terms of the Overton window and the way that we discuss issues? And I know you have, in particular, been at least aware of this, like on economic policy, right?
Technology policy. Josh Hawley isn't doing what Josh Hawley's doing.
Economic policy, foreign policy, and technology policy. Like these things, the way that Josh Hawley, Marco Rubio, Tom Cotton, many others are talking about China technology.
Tom Cotton would still be there, but the
Right.
other two are
Probably. But even on China, I'm not necessarily sure if it would be the same level of position. We could talk about, we literally speak with Tom Cotton so people can hear for themselves. But how have you seen that kind of play out after Trump became president? Because I think that's the most interesting phenomenon.
It's way more interesting than Trump. And I think it goes to that tabula rasa concept where people, Ted Cruz did not win the presidency.
Right.
If you wanted like Heritage Foundation conservative, you got Ted Cruz, and people did not want Ted Cruz. Mm-hmm. Now, that happened for many different reasons, but I think that what Josh Hawley and others within conservative circles saw is that there was a version of conservatism that they understood, that they thought that they knew what this was. And then voters said, that's not what we want. That is not, we did not think the Iraq War was a good idea.
Yeah.
We did not think that, like, these, we think that the government should be involved in providing health care in some form or fashion. And it's been interesting to see Trump kind of be like, scuttle away from it.
Yeah.
And so I think that has caused a real rift within conservatism. And I think that several rifts. I think that you are getting from some never Trump Republicans, not all of them. I think that there are people for whom they're like, he should not be the vanguard of this movement or what people think of when they think about conservatism. But I do think that there's a lot of Principal Skinner. Is it I who is out of touch? No, it is the children that you're getting from things were great in 2003. Things were not great in 2003. And I think that there's that rift, but I also think that there's the break between conservatives and their libertarian counterparts.
Yes.
They were once united through fusionism, this idea of we can get along to oppose the threat of communism or to support the concept of free markets. And then it turned out through the election, I think a lot of conservatives were like, actually, people don't like that.
Yeah.
Or it's not so much, because I think one thing that we occasionally forget when we write about politics or think about politics is that some voters are confused as we are. Like, voters are complicated people. Voters can simultaneously think that Chinese influence on our economy is bad, but our ability to get cheap goods is good.
Yes.
And those are easy things to square in your head if you're a voter, but not so much if you work at like AEI or something. And so I think that rift has been really interesting. And I think that actually is, some of it I think is incredibly cynical. I don't think that you're getting the government should go harder after obscenity prosecutions if the president is Hillary Clinton.
What are you referring to?
So there has been a move by some conservatives in kind of the specifically coming from kind of the traditional conservative wing, from the magazine First Things, which published a group letter called Against the Dead Consensus that talked about this a little bit, about kind of like, we need to break up with libertarians, and we need to use the state essentially to form a higher good or to support the highest good. Now, who decides what the highest good is? Who knows? But part of that has been with an effort to go hard after pornography and obscenity writ large, and it's something I've written about, because it essentially is it is not just about pornography. It is the idea that the government can determine what is good and what is bad for people, outside of specific FDA approval of things, but moral good. And that the government should be encouraging moral good as determined by someone.
Right.
And I think for a lot of libertarians, I spoke to Catherine Mangu Ward at Reason for a piece I wrote on this, and she was essentially like, this is the nanny state progressivism that we opposed, but now it's coming from Republicans. And so I think that's been a really interesting shift. And I mean, I think, as I said, I think a lot of it's cynical. I don't think it happens if Clinton is president. I think if Clinton is president, you have a lot more I'm a rock-ribbed libertarian Tea Party ethos, but it's what's happening right now.
Yeah, but I don't think it's cynical, I don't think it's cynical, but I agree to your point about Hillary. But I think the reason why, I think the feelings have always bubbled up there, but I think the reason why it's happening now is the social conservative. So you're referring to fusionism, the social conservative leg of the stool. I think they've realized.
Explain
that,
the stool, Marshall.
Yeah, so what Reagan did, or at least the idea of Reagan did, was he enabled conservatives to have three stools. So you had three legs supporting a stool. You had the foreign policy hawks, you had the fiscal conservatives, and then you had the social conservatives. And I think what the social conservatives have realized, and people like Reihan Salam and Ross Douthat that have written about this for a long time, was that actually the libertarian leg of the stool, the fiscal conservatives, they were always the most electorally weakest, but the most overly represented in D.C., New York, and San Francisco.
Yeah, it turns out the free market consensus wasn't really a consensus. And the Chamber of Commerce wing of the GOP, and that's a term that is not my own. I did not invent that. I think that has been bubbling for a long time. And I think especially because I think that when I think that the turn came when businesses started adhering, or, I mean, for many reasons, a lot of internal pressure, external pressure, started basically being more progressive on issues. And
Tim Cook in 2015.
Right, exactly. And so, when you have Apple calling out, state RFRAs, not the federal RFRA. The federal RFRA is awesome. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which at the federal level was caused in part by people trying to do mescaline. But when you have Apple and Salesforce, all like these major companies, and then you have a wing of the GOP that's basically like, if companies want to do it, companies can do it. You have social conservatives being like, no, that's not, no.
This is not a good deal for us.
This is not ideal. And I think that's been really interesting, because I think that when you have, one of the challenges, I taught a class at the University of Chicago this past fall on conservatism, which was a really interesting and fascinating experience. And I brought in speakers like Josh Hammer from Daily Wire and Charlie Sykes and Sohrab Ahmari and Nick Gillespie from Reason. And one of the things that I talked a lot about is that, there is a difference between philosophical conservatism and movement conservatism. And one of the things with movement conservatism is a lot of it has been united not so much by common shared principles, commonly shared positive principles, but by a common enemy, namely communism or the left. And so you can get a lot of juice out of just saying socialism sucks a whole bunch of times and being like,
can you get a lot of juice out of that?
You can get a lot of money out of that.
Yes, you can get a lot of money from wealthy old people.
Yeah.
But that's not, saying that something else sucks is not saying, and we're for
it's no positive good, right?
And that's been a big challenge with kind of campus conservatism, because they're like, okay, what are you actually for? And
free speech.
Yeah, and then
for what end though?
Yeah, and then whose speech? And well, then it all gets really messy. But so I think that's a challenge for conservatism, because you had an idea of what conservatism looked like that was based on that stool, that was based on Reaganism. And then you have these people now who are like, well, that was 40 years ago when he won in 1980. And, for a lot of younger conservatives, they don't obviously know Reagan in like a personal way. Yeah. But also, you see, it's been, I am always deeply amused by groups attempting to use like old speeches or old clips against other people. And so you have like Reagan being like an open borders immigration advocate, which I'm like, but it was different because of how time works. Yeah. And you see, Numbers USA does this all the time with Barbara Jordan, who I'm just like, I don't think she would be cool with you doing this. But like, it's interesting to see that shift, because the uniting principle now for many conservatives is like, we just don't like those people. And whatever it is, we just, it actually kind of goes back to the Buckley saying about, standing athwart progress, yelling stop.
Yeah.
Except progress is just whatever it is liberals want to do, whatever. But without kind of and this is what we're all united in being for.
Well, I think you are talking certainly about a professional grifting class here in D.C. I would say, one of the things Marshall and I really try and do here is figure that out. What is Like if you are to have a realignment on the right, if you are to rethink a free market consensus or a foreign policy consensus or a tech consensus, what does it look like if you are still to embrace kind of new ideas? So how have you seen that kind of begin to bubble up? Like you see with positive speeches by Senator Rubio, like on China, or Josh Hawley on technology policy, or I'm sure I'm missing many friends there, but I mean, how do you see that in the kind of the context of what we're talking about? Because I don't think that is rooted in no, we don't like these people. It is kind of the creation of a new good or a new positive that is definitely different than what it used to be talked about.
Right, and I think it's so different to me that I'm kind of like, I think about it in terms of how every year. College football teams, there's turnover. So there's turnover, and so college football team will get a new strength and conditioning coach. And he'll do something about, this year we're really going to emphasize, we're going to be faster and stronger and everything is going to be totally different. And then, they go 5-7 and everybody gets fired. So at this point, I'm kind of like, I am sure that Marco Rubio, when he gave that speech at Catholic University and thinks a lot about how social justice, kind of a Catholic concept of social justice, how that should influence government policy. And I'm like, cool, sure. But, if a Democrat wins the presidency and Marco Rubio is still in office, is he still making these points? Is Senator Mike Lee still talking about expanding the earned income tax credit or kind of expanding the concept of the quote-unquote welfare state, if we're in a different scenario? Now, I know that that's an almost impossible question because you can't know what you can't ever see. But I do think there are conservatives who are having these conversations and are, thinking more about positive good. But I also... what I keep thinking about is this also disconnected from voter sentiment? Is this just as disconnected as Paul Ryan's A Better Way was? Is this just as when you talk to, and especially because I think that even the concept of what is a conservative, which it's funny, there's been a lot of recent writing on this idea, but no one seems to be able to quite agree on what that means. And, I think that a lot of this has been shaped by our current context, by, the rise of deaths of despair, and thinking a lot about working class, well, specifically white working class men dealing with, a rising death rate or something like that. And a lot of, people have read J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy and thinking about that. But, that context existed in 1993 and 1984. And Republicans were like, and now it's time to help NAFTA. And so I think that for me, I'm kind of in a wait and see about what this actually means.
Sure.
Because I think, there is kind of a, I'm going to use this term, and I'm trying to divorce it from the person who came up with it, because I don't know if they all meant it at the time, a compassionate conservatism. I think that there is that idea, and I think that that's been around for a long time.
Sure.
But I'm a little bit skeptical about how deep a hold that has into into conservative voters. Because I think, it's all well and good if you're a think tank person and you're thinking about these ideas really deeply and thinking about how, Social Security could be reshaped or Medicare could be reshaped. But when you talk to conservative voters, what are they getting? Where are they getting this?
So what's really helpful that you sort of hit on is sort of in this moment, especially if you're sort of giving hot takes on the right, you really need to sort of sort through what's a trend that's going to be with us long term and what's sort of a specific, for example, I don't think conservatives are going to be focusing on the color scheme of Twitter in 3 years.
No.
But here are the trends. The trend is that conservative, and this is a Michael Lind argument, and I'm curious what your response is to it. The reason why we're going to see a conservatism that's more interested in the state and less interested in, let's say, limited government is that conservatives have no more access to major corporations. They are no longer sort of, if they ever were, at the heights of higher education. And finally, Hollywood and the culture, not just sort of in the annoying sort of they're doing, dirty movie sense, but very literally conservatives that basically have no presence in Hollywood or sort of the cultural heights places, tech companies too.
Right.
The only sort of place that conservative working class voters who are down market are going to have an ability to influence is the state. So if conservatives then, and this is why I think we push back on libertarians, if libertarians say, well, that's a statist thing, you can't do that, and you've basically given up the playing field.
Right.
And you basically have zero ability to influence
It's the last area we have to exercise our power, because this is what Lynn talks about, which is that there used to be a union for working class people. That's gone. There used to be churches that, by and large,
forced censorship
churches
in weird
which
ways.
had not forced censorship, but they had
Saga was forced.
Fine, they had some sort of power in terms of the culture. That's gone, and so that with all of these things gone, that it essentially has removed any ability for them to exercise power except in the state. And I feel like that is going to stay with us for quite some time.
I think so.
Yeah.
It's interesting because one, it's interesting you reference the breakup of unions, which I'm like, funny how that works.
Hey,
We weren't alive for that.
By the way,
we're not accountable.
we weren't around.
1990s. I'm not going to take responsibility for the 70s.
I think it's so interesting to me that liberals think conservatives have like this yawning maw of power at their disposal, and conservatives think liberals have the yawning maw of power, and I'm like, well, you both can't be right.
You can be if you go up by category.
Yeah,
in
it's like,
government right now, it's the Supreme Court.
Right.
But liberals have power in the economy, culture,
Yes.
and this sort of in the technology industry. But yes, conservatives right now.
By that argument, the existence of, and I think about this a lot because when people talk about like race and racism, there's occasionally the like, well, the most famous people in America are black people, and I'm like, and congratulations to them, but like that does not political power make. I think that, but I do think that sentiment of being like, no, we have to influence the state. One, I think that is here to stay, but it's so different. Like, I think for a lot of conservatives, they very much were going from the Andrew Breitbartism of, politics is downstream of culture. And now you're seeing the exact opposite argument being made in publications like First Things and Journal of American Greatness of like, no, like, politics can beat the shit out of culture if it wants to. And I think that is a really interesting shift. I did a piece a couple of years ago talking about California conservatism, which was laser focused on culture, because it basically was like, well, we will never have political influence in the state ever again, which to me, I'm like, well, anything literally can happen. Ronald Reagan was governor of the state within like lived memory of many people. But I do think that the key, controlling the state and then using it to conservative ends, and that being a good, I think is a really interesting shift. I think that's one of those things where the cynicism kind of creeps back, where it's just kind of like unelected judges making decisions are bad unless they're for us, in which they're awesome. But I also think that is going to shift how because at a certain point, political power is, I think, to me, a more important form of power, a better, better weapon to use as a cudgel, but it's not as visible. And there's a writer now at the New York Times, Elizabeth Brunig, who talks a lot about how conservatives want the culture and liberals want the politics, and neither has either. And I think that that's really true, because I think that there very much is, there will not be, despite the efforts of many who have tried. I wrote a piece because I grew up in reading like a lot of evangelical publications for long and varied reasons, and I've always been interested by kind of the evangelical interpretation of popular culture, and the kind of the effort to create an evangelical popular culture that would at least rival, if not replace, popular culture, which hasn't really gone that well, but they're working on it. And it's been so interesting to me that the idea that that culture has been ceded to the left is still so present, but also that like conservatives would then say like, well, that's it, we're out, but we've got judges. And I think it's a fascinating I feel like my wording is, it's because it's so interesting to stand and observe two sides of politics that simultaneously believes that the other side is way power, but they have moral authority. And to see those two go at each other because the other is both. I mean, I think that this was always the funniest argument, funniest thing when people talked about, like Hillary Clinton being like all the conspiracy theories around Hillary Clinton, which is just like, okay, so you think that she's like a serial killer, but she didn't kill Anthony Weiner. Like at a certain
She's
point,
an incompetent serial killer.
which I was just like, like at a certain point, you were asking me to believe that she is a super evil villain, but also entirely incompetent and did not go to Wisconsin.
Yeah, there's not a lot of logical.
Like at a certain point,
coherence.
I'm like, there's a logical leap here. You're asking me to make that I just won't do. But I think that is, to me, one of the reasons I'm so interested in conspiracy theories is because I think that they have a lot to say about how we think about the world.
Absolutely.
And I think that one of those things is the idea that there is, when I get emails from the kind of the Heritage Blast emails or kind of conservative outlet emails, and they're just like, the left is running rampant. And like the example is like one trans kid in a state that you don't live in did something and you're mad about it. And I'm just like, really? And then, you get the same emails from like The Nation that's like, the right is like gonna come and burn down your house. And the example is like a judge issued an opinion, but it was in a dissent and it didn't actually happen. And I'm like, guys, we all need to just like, no. Like
what you're really critiquing is the nonprofit donation system.
Yeah, right.
But Sagar,
I think that, that's the real enemy here.
Yeah, so I think our last section that Sagar should actually lead us into is about Bernie Sanders and socialism. Because I think a lot of I think to your point about things that are both true and false at the same time, I think a lot of people's grand narratives about the past 4 years are going to go, or if Bernie wins the primary, because you're going to see like sort of democratic socialist revolutionary change versus sort of like weird like right-wing populism. Like Sagar, like lead us into that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the real question I want to get with you is how that might change the right and expose kind of what you're talking about with this tabula rasa, which is that, like you see this with Bernie. And with Bernie, he's kind of already bubbled up some of, in my opinion, the worst elements of the American right, which is that you have hundreds of millions of dollars that are getting ready to be spent on socialism takes, capitalism creates ads, which I don't think is electorally going to work.
Why?
And I can go into that. I mean, I think this is something that Trump ran against inherently in 2016, which is capitalism creates jobs in China and Africa, and it turns out it takes them away from Ohio. And so these are one of those things where, you can still be a capitalist and believe that markets are made by men and that maybe we should do something about it whenever it comes to protecting our own citizens. I guess I'm curious about how, because you talk to a lot of other people on the right for that piece in which we originally spoke about. What's the counter to my view, right? And which do you ultimately think might prevail going into that election, and how might it come about if Bernie were to win or if Trump were to win?
Well, to your first question, how do they think about it? I think that there is, again, these are all reliant on multiple theories of change that have not yet happened. Well, there's kind of the first, which is that Americans hate socialism.
Yeah.
Which I think, again, is reliant on polling questions about, one, what is socialism? There was a piece in Reason magazine that made the point of Americans hate socialism, but and again, libertarian publication, and they're like, well, Social Security, all of Medicare, Medicaid. There have been a number of government programs that the right or some entity basically railed against as being socialist programs, and now people are like, actually, we love these.
They're overwhelmingly
programs.
popular.
We're incredibly into them, and I think that that's one of the challenges that happens when I think Sanders supporters talk about like these country comparisons, it drives me insane because I'm like, if you can find another country of like 370 million people that's as racially and ethnically diverse as we are, but that also has a federal system in which states and the federal government are supposed to have like separate powers, well then we'll compare it to that. But we're not comparing it to freaking Norway.
Right.
But I think that, the socialism argument of like Americans are inherently opposed to socialism, which one, again, it's a definitional problem.
Correct.
But two, like that doesn't tell you anything else. Like Americans don't like this thing. I mean, I feel like that's essentially, I am reminded of in 2004, it was like, well, Bush is unpopular. Americans don't like Bush. Mm-hmm. I'm like, but that's not a campaign. That's just sort of a thing that is true. I think though, going to your point, when we talked, and I talked to a couple other people, one of the interesting things is that, it is easy. Trump will have to claim that America has now become great again, and now we have to keep America great. When many of the people who voted for him on a Make America Great Again message have not yet seen the greatness. And it's been very interesting to me.
This got to a problem, though, which is that it's a tabula rasa. So, I don't know, like, for me, I could define greatness as Brett Kavanaugh smashing through what I see as the liberal media. I could say it's the idea of the wall, right? Like, we could get into the technical. But, like, and you could also say, like, look, like, we've ended 40 years of complacency with China. So, there are actually a lot of people who think that message is going to resonate with.
I think so, but I also think I just keep thinking about there's author Chris Arnade who wrote this book.
Yeah,
Dignity.
I'm on the
He's been on the
podcast.
podcast.
He's great.
Yes.
And I keep thinking about his work and how people, the people he talked to, interpreted events, and a lot of what you were just bringing up. The people in that book would be like, what?
Right, but they didn't vote in the first place. And that's actually one of Chris's key points.
I think that actually, and we've talked a lot about this, Chris and I, because one of his points is that when white people are, white people go populist and black people stop voting, it kind of in response to kind of economic and social malaise. And I think that actually goes to Sanders's message, which is that, like, the people, he could talk about, farm subsidies, which, by the way, that's kind of socialistic, and has led to me making many great leap forward jokes that were received very well by the internet. But I think that there is a challenge. I mean, one of the things about Trump is that, like, I'm sitting here thinking, like, well, how will he make this argument? I'm like, he'll just make it. Like, it doesn't really require. It doesn't really require like cogent thought to do. I do think that the simultaneous, in 2016, he was railing against Wall Street. And whether or not he believed it, I think that there were people who kind of were like, well, it's Hillary Clinton who loves Wall Street, or Donald Trump who purportedly hates Wall Street. And now he's the one who's basically like, but aren't your 401ks doing well? Isn't the stock market doing awesome? And I think that is, it might not prove to be a challenge for him, but I do think that is a weird argument to be making. And especially because he is going to be relying on the same economic indicators that he spent 2 years telling everyone that were bullshit. Do you remember him talking about how, like, the jobs numbers, like, you just can't believe them. Right. Or the unemployment numbers, they're fake news. And now it's like, the job numbers are super real and amazingly awesome.
That's always been an issue for me. Is I think he was right that they are BS. Like, I think he is correct that a lot of these indicators are astroturfed as to the real problems.
Well, especially because unemployment numbers don't count people who are not
labor force.
But this goes to your point, though, Jane, which is that just as people are not following the Brett Kavanaugh nomination 2 years later, people are not following 2015 takes about jobs and econ numbers. What they are following is probably, especially November 2020, is going to be what's the state of the stock market and the economy.
I want to give Trump credit. Like, Pew polling that just came out like a week ago says that he has got the highest approval rating on the economy since George W. Bush in 2001 in the post 9/11 era. Right. So People are feeling something.
Yeah.
How that translates to a vote, I
Right.
truly have actually no idea.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing.
Like-
Is like I after 2016, I'm like I'm out of the prognostication business. I don't know.
The most reasonable take we've
Yeah,
ever
No,
had on
I
this
don't.
podcast.
I just don't know. Like, especially because you're like, any of these people could hypothetically beat Trump. Trump could hypothetically beat any of these
Correct.
people. I don't know. Whatever it is, probably going to be closer than people think it will be. But I do think that it is interesting to see how much. I've thought a lot about how Trump and the Trump administration are sometimes two different things. Like the Trump administration, very tough on Russia. Trump, less tough on Russia.
Right.
Or like, but also I think that means that there is kind of one thing I think that will be key to follow is how much Trump and Trumpian conservatism have anything to do with each other and how much they need each other and how long, the coattails of Trump, because how many candidates are running right now in GOP primaries on like who's the Trumpiest Trump to ever Trump a Trump. And you've seen that in states. I remember a couple of years ago, the first piece I wrote for Vox was about Kelly Ward's campaign in Arizona, which was essentially like, what if you just like took Trump and then boiled him down and then smoked him? And that's what Kelly Ward
And removed the weird charisma, too.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is why it didn't work.
Yes, and it decidedly did not work. But they had these two staffers who basically went from like campaign to campaign, like Trumpy campaign to Trumpy campaign, being like, we can make you even Trumpier.
But that's actually been a good story for me out of the Trump era, which is that, putting on a red hat and saying drain the swamp actually is not going to cut it, which is that you actually do have to have some level of ideological coherence behind what you're saying that Trump ran on in order to actually win and resonate with voters.
And it's interesting because it seems that only Trump can get away without having that at all. Without if draining the swamp, well, I think it also comes down to what do these phrases actually mean?
Yeah, and
Because I think-
voters is the key.
What do they mean, two voters? Like, if draining the swamp meant, like, cutting down on lobbyists in D.C., mission absolutely not accomplished. It is, there are lobbyists all over the place. Like, it is a very swampy administration from that perspective of grift and excessive spending and that perspective.
I would say the swamp, more than anything, meant to the GOP voter, maybe I'm wrong, is really about technocracy. And that it was an unchecked technocracy. In my opinion, the way they looked at it was technocracy and influenced particularly by moneyed elite and the financial elite from a left perspective.
See, dude,
that
I'm
is kind of
gonna-
how I
I'm
look
gonna
at
disagree.
it. If you want, go for it.
Technocracy? Like what? Like
No, I think that's why I think the deep state narrative has resonated
But that wasn't
so
what he
much.
ran it. But he wasn't. But it wasn't.
Right.
What he, no, but like, and this is the problem, right? Which is, I think you get to this in your pieces, which is there's this huge danger. I think the California conservatives, who will go unnamed, are guilty of this overly intellectualizing this person. Because at the end of the day, I think
that is the tabula rasa thing. Is that you can
Yeah.
like, what he actually
Yes,
meant was the technocracy. When I'm like, if I would like to hear Donald J. Trump explain the word technocracy.
Oh, I don't know if he can. I'm saying
like-
I'm trying to speculate as to what did it mean to cause millions of people to come out and vote.
no, but millions of people.
Right.
No, but this is the dude. Millions of people
Yeah.
didn't come out and vote.
I
We'll
think-
cut the dudes.
Well,
I'm saying
yeah.
dude too much, but But no, like Hillary Clinton was one of the worst nominees
Correct.
in modern American history. People didn't really come out, and Trump lost the popular
And there
vote.
are millions,
No,
but there are millions of Obama Trump people who did switch their votes. An empirical fact.
I think that,
and so
I think that there is two things on that. I think occasionally, like, there's Obama Trump counties where
Yes.
Obama voters dropped out because there was a great piece right after the election about black voters in Milwaukee who were basically like, we didn't vote and we don't care.
yeah, I remember.
But
that.
I do think that there is a degree to which I think that for some people, like Obama felt authentic, and Clinton, who literally was basically like, you want 4 more years of Obama? Say no more. We'll get you exactly that. I think that turned people off. But I think that trying to interpret what voters took from, if there's anything I've been learning over the past couple months in the primaries process, when you read like voter interviews, we're like, well, I voted for Trump in 2016, but now I'm really into Pete Buttigieg.
Right,
But
yeah.
if he
And
doesn't
Medicare for all.
And
and Medicare for all.
Yeah.
But then, if Pete doesn't win the nomination, I'll just vote for Trump again, which I'm just like, sure. okay.
Yeah.
I mean, because I think that there's this idea of the voter. And I think that you especially get this when people talk about non-white voters, black voters or Asian voters, where it's like kind of this idea of like your opinions are based on this thing or based on not this thing. And I'm like, no, like we're just people who are as confused as anyone else.
Right.
And so I think that is a real challenge. And that's why I have no idea what would happen if Sanders were to win or if Trump were to win again.
That was going to be our last question
right.
for you. So thanks for preempting us.
Sorry.
No like you said, no
prognosticating.
Yeah, I do think that a Sanders win, my only prognostication, and I realize that this is making me sound like all of those pieces from 2015, 2016 about how Democrats should root for Trump because even if he won, it wouldn't be that bad.
People will hold that over your head for 4 years, so careful.
People, and I'm like, this is like, I see where this goes. I'm just like my DMs would be unreadable. But I do think that the like theory of revolutionary change behind Bernie Sanders, unless Democrats also won the Senate, would be relative to what some people on the internet think it would be, muted. That is my only statement, and I'm prepared to be wrong. If Democrats, swept the, took back the Senate and won the White House, and in like a year we're talking about how like Medicare for All has been implemented, and sure, okay.
You cover the right, so you're
I know.
okay to
Yeah,
not
it's
get
all-
that call
all
right.
good.
I know. No, I think it's funny though because I cover the right. There's a lot of like Democratic politics where I'm just like, I don't know. They all seem like people. Okay, they're all like. I think that's something that there have been some interesting writing on, though not enough. Is that apparently like the big challenge in primary states is not that like you love one candidate and hate the others. It's that like people are like, actually, I would vote for any of these people.
This is causing a big problem right now.
Yeah, where it's just
turnout is relatively lower than people expected because they're like, I'll just vote for whoever becomes a Democrat.
Yeah, they're just basically, like it's like everybody turned into my parents who are pretty much just like, whatever they come up with, it'll be fine and we'll vote for them. And I'm like, okay. I mean, I which I think is probably a much healthier interpretation of politics than to just, because I think like there's something, I've never been like super into any particular candidate in an election before. I put all of my emotional marbles into sports where they belong, which is it's the safest place for them.
It's much healthier.
Well, I mean,
Unless it's 2013.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think that most people they are not most people are not primary voters. They are not driving to New Hampshire from Iowa to like go work for a candidate or something like that.
Right.
So I think their interpretation of politics is probably more akin to what normal people feel like. But yeah, that I don't prognosticate anymore. I don't know.
Right.
I don't know, and I'm trying to find out. That's my job.
Good for you. All right, Jane, we have to go. Thank you so much for joining us.
Of course,
Really
absolutely.
appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Whew.